Kids like her don't usually make it very far. The words landed in the crowded conference room with the weight of a slammed door. Conversation stopped. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Even the soft hum of the ceiling vents seemed to disappear for a moment. 12-year-old Zoe Carter stood beside her father, clutching a worn blue folder against her chest as every eye in the room slowly turned toward her. Mrs. Linda Grayson sat at the far end of the long table, her hands neatly folded, her expression calm, almost casual, as if she had merely stated a simple fact. But facts didn't make a child's heart drop into her stomach. Facts didn't make a father suddenly forget how to breathe. Elijah Carter stared at the teacher for several seconds. The fluorescent lights above reflected against the polished tabletop between them. Around the room, parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nobody said a word. Zoe felt heat creeping into her cheeks. She lowered her eyes toward the folder she had spent weeks preparing. Inside were certificates, essays, test scores, and recommendations. Hours of work, late nights, early mornings, sacrifices nobody in that room would ever see. Yet somehow, a single sentence had made all of it feel invisible. Elijah's jaw tightened. He had spent most of his life hearing people make assumptions. Assumptions about where he came from. Assumptions about what he could accomplish. Assumptions about the color of his skin. But hearing those assumptions aimed at his daughter felt different. It felt heavier. Through the large windows behind the conference table, autumn sunlight stretched across the school parking lot. Yellow leaves drifted across the pavement in slow circles. The world outside looked peaceful. Inside, something had shifted. Principal Daniel Brooks sat quietly near the center of the table. His expression remained unreadable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't speak. He simply watched. Mrs. Grayson adjusted a stack of papers in front of her. "I'm only trying to be realistic," she continued. "Advanced academic programs are extremely demanding. Not every student is prepared for that level of competition." Several parents exchanged glances. A few looked away. Others stared down at their notes. Zoe remained silent. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the folder until her knuckles turned pale. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the meeting to end. Most of all, she wanted someone to see her for who she was instead of what they expected her to be. Elijah finally placed one hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. The gesture was small, quiet, but it steadied her. She looked up at him. His face remained calm despite the storm building behind his eyes. Years as a firefighter had taught him many things. Stay focused under pressure. Protect the people who depend on you. Never let fear make your decisions. The scar running along his left forearm caught the afternoon light as he squeezed her shoulder once. Not hard, just enough to remind her she wasn't standing alone. Across the room, Principal Brooks leaned back slightly in his chair. His gaze moved from Zoe to the folder in her hands, then to Mrs. Grayson, then back again. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. And though nobody in that room realized it yet, the sentence that had embarrassed a young girl was about to become the beginning of a story the entire school would remember for years. The meeting ended 10 minutes later, but the words stayed with Zoe long after the chairs scraped against the floor and the parents filtered into the hallway. She walked beside her father through the bright corridor, keeping her eyes fixed on the rows of student artwork hanging along the walls. Crayon drawings, science fair ribbons, photographs from school events. Pieces of children proudly displayed for everyone to see. Yet somehow she felt smaller than she had all year. Elijah noticed it immediately. Normally, Zoe pointed out every little thing she passed. A new poster, a funny bulletin board, a trophy case update. Today she said nothing. The late afternoon sun poured through the tall windows overlooking the football field, painting long golden rectangles across the polished floor. Students hurried toward buses and waiting parents. Lockers slammed. Sneakers squeaked against tile. Life moved forward. But for Zoe, everything felt stuck. When they finally reached Elijah's pickup truck, she climbed into the passenger seat and placed the blue folder carefully on her lap. Neither spoke as they pulled out of the parking lot. The silence was not angry. It was heavy. Outside, maple trees lined the streets of their neighborhood, their leaves glowing shades of amber and red beneath the October sky. After several minutes, Elijah glanced toward his daughter. "You know she was wrong, right?" Zoe stared through the window. "Then why did everybody look so uncomfortable?" The question settled between them. Elijah tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Some questions were harder to answer than others. Because sometimes people stay quiet when they should speak, he said softly. Zoe nodded, but did not look convinced. Their small house sat on a quiet corner, lot less than 3 miles from the school. The white paint on the porch railing had begun to fade. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. It was not a fancy home, but every inch of it carried memories. Family dinners, homework sessions, birthday cakes, long conversations at the kitchen table. As soon as they stepped inside, Zoe headed straight for her room. Elijah remained near the front door for a moment. The house felt unusually still. A framed photograph rested on a nearby shelf. It showed him years earlier standing beside a fire engine, smiling beneath a bright summer sky. Back then, his life had looked very different. He had spent nearly 15 years serving the city as a firefighter. Long shifts, emergency calls, community events. He loved every part of it. Then one difficult day changed everything. A serious injury ended the career he had built his life around. The recovery took months. The adjustment took years. Suddenly, he was no longer the man rushing toward emergencies. He was a father learning how to rebuild. And through every challenge, one person had kept him moving forward. Zoe. That evening, the familiar glow of a desk lamp spilled beneath her bedroom door. Elijah gently knocked before stepping inside. Books covered the desk. Notes filled the walls. Color-coded index cards sat stacked beside open textbooks. Zoe was already studying. Her pencil moved steadily across a notebook page. She never looked up. Elijah stood there quietly, watching. Outside the window, darkness slowly settled over the neighborhood. Inside the room, determination flickered brighter than the lamp beside her. And for the first time since the meeting ended, Elijah realized something important. Mrs. Grayson had judged his daughter based on who she thought Zoe was. She had never bothered to discover who Zoe was becoming. The following week arrived with the crisp chill that always settled over the town before Halloween. Morning frost clung to patches of grass along the sidewalks, and a thin layer of mist hovered above the football field as students streamed toward the school entrance. Zoe Carter walked through the front doors carrying the same blue folder, though now it seemed heavier than before. Not because of the papers inside, but because of everything it represented. Determination, hope, and a growing need to prove something she had never asked to prove. Inside room 214, Mrs. Linda Grayson stood beside the whiteboard reviewing assignments for the week. Her classroom was organized with almost military precision. Every marker aligned, every worksheet stacked perfectly, every chair positioned in straight rows. Students often described her as demanding. Parents described her as rigorous. Mrs. Grayson preferred another word, realistic. She believed success belonged to those who fit certain expectations. She never said it directly, but it revealed itself in small ways. The students she encouraged, the students she overlooked, the opportunities she offered, the opportunities she quietly withheld. As the bell rang, Zoe took her usual seat near the window. Pale sunlight filtered through the glass, casting soft patterns across her notebook. She opened it immediately and began reviewing science concepts for an upcoming academic competition. Across the room, several students chatted excitedly about sports, weekend plans, and upcoming school events. Zoe remained focused on her notes. She had learned that excellence often required working when nobody was watching. Halfway through class, Mrs. Grayson began discussing a statewide academic challenge scheduled for later that semester. The competition was prestigious. Students from across the state would participate. Winners could earn scholarships, mentorship opportunities, and invitations to advanced educational programs. Several hands shot into the air. Questions filled the room. Excitement spread quickly. Zoe listened carefully. Her pulse quickened. This was exactly the type of opportunity she had dreamed about. As Mrs. Grayson explained the application process, Zoe quietly raised her hand. The teacher noticed, but continued speaking. A few moments later, Zoe raised it again. This time Mrs. Grayson looked directly at her. Yes, Zoe. The classroom grew still. I would like to apply for the competition, Zoe said. Her voice was calm, but steady. Several students turned toward her. Mrs. Grayson paused for a second longer than necessary. Then she offered a tight smile. The program is extremely competitive, she replied. Many students underestimate the level of preparation required. The words sounded harmless on the surface, yet something beneath them lingered. Something familiar. Zoe felt it immediately. Around her, a few classmates exchanged glances. One student shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another lowered her eyes toward her desk. Zoe nodded politely. "I understand," she said. Mrs. Grayson continued the lesson, but the atmosphere had changed. By lunchtime, news about the competition spread throughout the school. Students gathered around tables discussing practice schedules and study groups. In the cafeteria, sunlight poured through tall windows overlooking the courtyard. The smell of pizza and fresh bread filled the air. Zoe sat quietly with her lunch tray, reviewing information on her tablet. She barely noticed the noise around her. What she noticed was a message appearing in her inbox. The sender's name made her pause. Principal Daniel Brooks. Her heart skipped. Slowly, she opened the email. The message was brief, professional, direct, yet one sentence stood out above all the others. "I would like to discuss your academic goals after school this Friday." Zoe stared at the screen. Across the cafeteria, students laughed and talked as if it were any ordinary day. But something told her that Friday's conversation might change everything. Friday arrived beneath a sky the color of brushed steel. Low clouds drifted over the town, softening the afternoon sunlight and casting long shadows across the school grounds. Throughout the day, Zoe found herself glancing at the clock more often than usual. Every class seemed longer. Every minute stretched. The email from Principal Brooks remained open in her mind like a question waiting for an answer. By 3:15, the final bell echoed through the hallways. Students poured from classrooms carrying backpacks, sports equipment, and weekend plans. Laughter bounced off the lockers. Doors opened and closed. The familiar energy of dismissal swept through the building. Yet Zoe moved more slowly than everyone else. She carefully organized her notebooks, zipped her backpack, and made her way toward the administrative wing. The corridor grew quieter with every step. Here, the walls displayed framed photographs of past graduating classes, academic achievements, and community awards. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, creating pale ribbons of light across the floor. Outside the principal's office, Zoe paused and took a deep breath. Through the glass panel beside the door, she could see Principal Daniel Brooks seated behind his desk reviewing paperwork. He looked up almost immediately and offered a warm smile. "Come in, Zoe." His office felt different from the classrooms she knew. Bookshelves lined one wall. A collection of student artwork filled another. The scent of coffee and old books lingered in the air. Near the window sat several framed photographs showing former students at college graduations, scholarship ceremonies, and science competitions. It felt less like an office and more like a place where possibilities were stored. Zoe sat carefully in the chair across from his desk. Principal Brooks folded his hands and studied her for a moment. Not critically, thoughtfully. "I have been reviewing student performance reports," he began. "Your teachers have submitted assessments from the last 3 years. Zoe, listen quietly. Your scores are exceptional." She blinked. The compliment caught her off guard. "Thank you, sir." Brooks opened a folder. Inside were charts, evaluations, and academic records. "You consistently perform above grade level in mathematics, science, and reading comprehension. Your independent projects are particularly impressive." Zoe felt a mixture of pride and disbelief. Most adults noticed her grades. Very few noticed the projects she completed on her own time. The principal reached for a stack of papers. "This environmental research proposal was yours." Zoe nodded. "Yes, sir." Brooks smiled slightly. "I spent 30 minutes reading it." Her eyes widened. "You did?" "I did." He leaned back in his chair. "And frankly, I was surprised." The room grew still. For a brief second, Zoe wondered if she should feel worried. Then he continued. "I was surprised because work at this level is uncommon, even among older students." Warm sunlight slipped through the office window and reflected against the polished wood desk. Zoe felt something shift inside her. Not confidence exactly, more like relief. The relief of being seen. Principal Brooks closed the folder and slid a new document across the desk. At the top appeared the logo of the State Academic Excellence Program. Zoe stared at it. "I would like to nominate you for this year's Advanced Scholars Initiative," Brooks said. Her heart nearly stopped. The program was one of the most competitive academic opportunities in the state. Thousands applied. Only a handful were selected. "Sir, are you serious?" Brooks smiled. "Very." Zoe looked down at the application packet resting before her. The pages seemed almost unreal. For weeks, she had been questioning herself, questioning her abilities, questioning whether she belonged. Now an entirely different question stood before her. Not whether she could compete, whether she was ready to discover just how far she could go. As she gathered the documents and stood to leave, Principal Brooks spoke one final sentence. Do not let anyone else's expectations become the ceiling for your future. Zoe stepped into the hallway, holding the packet tightly against her chest. She did not know it yet, but someone else in the building was about to learn that lesson as well. The weeks that followed settled into a demanding rhythm. Every afternoon after school, Zoe carried the Scholar's Initiative packet home and spread its contents across the kitchen table. Research materials, practice assessments, reading assignments, application essays. What had once felt like an opportunity now felt like a mountain rising higher each day. Outside, November winds rattled the windows and swept fallen leaves across the neighborhood streets. Inside, the warm glow above the kitchen table often remained on long after sunset. Elijah watched it happen night after night. He would finish washing dishes and find Zoe still working. He would wake up early and discover new pages of notes stacked neatly beside her textbooks. The effort was undeniable, yet pressure had a way of growing in silence. One Tuesday morning, students were called into the auditorium for a briefing about upcoming academic competitions. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the polished floor. Banners from past achievements hung high above the stage. Teachers stood along the walls while students settled into their seats. Zoe sat near the center, notebook resting on her lap. Principal Brooks welcomed everyone and reviewed opportunities available throughout the district. The atmosphere felt hopeful, encouraging. Then the question and answer session began. Several students asked about requirements for advanced programs. Others asked about scholarship pathways. Finally, a student from the back raised a hand and asked how recommendations were selected. Before Principal Brooks could answer, Mrs. Grayson stepped forward from the side of the stage. Recommendations are based on readiness, she explained. Sometimes students become excited about opportunities that are simply beyond their current level. Her voice remained calm, professional, yet something in the way she said it made Zoe's stomach tighten. The teacher's eyes briefly passed across the audience. Then they landed on Zoe for less than a second. It was enough. The message felt clear. Around her, several students shifted in their seats. One girl looked down at her notebook. Another glanced toward Zoe before quickly looking away. Nobody laughed. Nobody said anything. Somehow that felt worse. By the time the assembly ended, uncertainty had already begun spreading through Zoe's thoughts. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Equations seemed harder. Reading passages felt longer. Even simple questions suddenly carried doubt behind them. What if Mrs. Grayson was right? What if Principal Brooks had overestimated her? What if she failed in front of everyone? That evening, rain tapped softly against the kitchen window. The house smelled faintly of tomato soup and fresh bread. Elijah sat in the living room reviewing bills while Zoe worked at the table. For nearly an hour, the only sounds were turning pages and distant rainfall. Then something unusual happened. Zoe stopped writing. Her pencil remained motionless above the paper. Elijah looked up. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across the table. Open books surrounded her. Notes covered nearly every available surface. Yet she stared at a blank section of her application essay, as though the words had disappeared. Everything okay? Elijah asked gently. Zoe forced a small smile. I am fine. But the answer arrived too quickly, too rehearsed. Elijah studied his daughter for a moment. The shadows beneath her eyes were deeper than usual. Her shoulders looked heavier. Outside, the rain continued falling steadily through the darkness. Inside, doubt had quietly entered the room. And for the first time since beginning this journey, Zoe wondered whether determination alone would be enough. The rain continued through most of the evening, tracing thin silver lines down the kitchen window as the neighborhood settled into silence. Streetlights glowed softly against the wet pavement outside, their reflections shimmering in small puddles scattered across the road. Inside the Carter home, the warmth of the house contrasted with the cold November night pressing gently against the glass. Zoe remained at the kitchen table long after dinner. Open textbooks surrounded her. Research notes formed neat stacks beside her laptop. Highlighters, index cards, and handwritten outlines covered nearly every inch of the wooden surface. Yet for the first time in weeks, very little progress was being made. The blinking cursor on her screen seemed almost frozen. Elijah noticed. He had noticed long before she stopped writing. He saw it in the way her shoulders slumped, in the way she stared at pages without turning them, in the way she answered questions with only a few words. Sometimes the hardest burdens were the ones nobody else could see. Near 10 o'clock, Elijah quietly walked into the kitchen carrying a folded blanket. The room was illuminated by a single lamp hanging above the table. Its golden light softened the edges of everything it touched. Zoe had fallen asleep. One arm rested across an open notebook. A pencil remained loosely held between her fingers. Her reading glasses sat slightly crooked on the edge of her nose. Several pages of calculations and notes stretched across the table beneath her. Elijah stood still for a moment. The sight pulled at something deep inside him. He remembered the little girl who used to build science projects out of cardboard boxes on the living room floor. The little girl who asked endless questions about stars, weather patterns, and how airplanes stayed in the sky. That curiosity had never disappeared. It had simply grown stronger. Carefully, he draped the blanket across her shoulders. Zoe stirred slightly, but did not wake. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. Inside, the only sound was the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional turning of a page as a draft from the heating vent moved through the room. Elijah pulled out a chair and sat across from her. He did not wake her. He did not lecture her about confidence or determination. He simply sat there, watching, thinking, understanding. On the refrigerator door nearby hung dozens of reminders from years past. Elementary school certificates, honor roll notices, a faded photograph from a science fair. Small victories collected over time. Proof that growth often happened one quiet step at a time. His eyes eventually settled on a handwritten note Zoe had taped there several years earlier. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges. In uneven handwriting, it read, "Keep learning even when it feels hard." Elijah smiled. She had written that when she was 9, long before advanced programs, long before academic competitions, long before anyone questioned whether she belonged. The clock above the stove ticked steadily forward. 10:15, 10:30, 10:45. The world outside seemed to slow beneath the falling rain. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed through the darkness. Zoe shifted slightly in her sleep. The blanket remained wrapped around her shoulders. A page from her application packet fluttered gently beneath the warm airflow from the vent. Elijah glanced down and saw the title of her essay, Future Environmental Innovators Initiative. The words no longer looked intimidating. They looked earned. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. For weeks, people had been measuring Zoe against expectations, comparing her against assumptions, questioning what she could accomplish. Yet sitting there in the quiet glow of the kitchen light, surrounded by evidence of effort nobody else had witnessed, Elijah realized something simple. Success was never built in public. It was built in moments exactly like this one. Alone, unseen, one page at a time. And while doubt had entered the room earlier that evening, it seemed much smaller now beneath the steady light of perseverance. 3 weeks later, winter announced its arrival with a sharp morning wind that swept across the school campus and sent students hurrying through the front doors with their coats pulled tight. The trees surrounding the parking lot stood nearly bare now, their branches etched against a pale gray sky. Inside the building, however, an entirely different kind of energy filled the hallways. The results from the State Academic Excellence Program were scheduled to be released that afternoon. By lunchtime, conversations about acceptance letters and scholarship opportunities echoed through classrooms, cafeterias, and corridors. Students refreshed email inboxes between classes. Teachers whispered predictions. Guidance counselors moved through the day with knowing smiles. Even those who had not applied seemed curious about the outcome. Zoe tried to focus on her lessons, but concentration proved impossible. Every glance at the clock felt longer than the last. The hours crawled forward. During science class, she reviewed notes she had already memorized. During reading period, she reread the same page 3 times without absorbing a single sentence. Her thoughts remained fixed on one question. Had all the effort been enough? By 2:30 in the afternoon, the final period was underway. Outside, light snow had begun drifting across the football field in slow, silent spirals. The classroom windows reflected the pale winter sky. Students worked quietly while Mrs. Grayson moved between rows collecting assignments. Her expression remained unchanged, calm and controlled as always. Then the intercom crackled overhead. The sound immediately drew every eye toward the ceiling. "Zoe Carter, please report to the principal's office." The room became still. Several students looked up from their desks. Mrs. Grayson paused beside a row of tables. Zoe felt her heartbeat quicken. She gathered her notebook and stood. The walk to the administrative wing seemed longer than usual. Her footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor. Outside the windows, snowflakes continued drifting downward. Inside, anticipation followed her through every hallway. When she reached Principal Brooks's office, his assistant greeted her with a smile she could not quite interpret. "Go right in," she said. Principal Brooks was standing near the window when Zoe entered. Beside him sat two other administrators and a representative from the district academic board. The sight immediately made her nervous. Nobody looked disappointed. Yet nobody spoke right away either. The silence stretched. Then Principal Brooks handed her a large envelope. The official seal of the State Academic Excellence Program was stamped across the front. Zoe stared at it. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The words blurred for a second before coming into focus. "Congratulations." She blinked. "Then read the sentence again." "Congratulations." Her breath caught. Principal Brooks smiled first. Then the district representative. Then everyone else in the room. "Not only were you accepted," Brooks said softly, "you received one of the highest evaluation scores in the entire state." Zoe's eyes widened. For a moment, she simply stood there, unable to speak. The district representative opened a folder and continued. "Your research proposal ranked among the strongest submissions we reviewed this year. Several evaluators specifically highlighted your analytical work and independent study efforts." The room suddenly felt brighter, warmer. Every late night at the kitchen table flashed through her memory. Every page of notes. Every moment of doubt. Every quiet sacrifice. Principal Brooks glanced toward another document resting on his desk. "There is something else you should know." Zoe looked up. Brooks picked up a report and smiled. "Your score placed you ahead of every applicant from this school." The words settled gently into the room. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the window. Inside, a truth that had been questioned for months finally stood undeniable. And somewhere else in the building, a teacher who had underestimated a student was about to learn exactly how wrong she had been. The announcement spread through the school faster than the snowfall outside. By the next morning, students were discussing the results in hallways, classrooms, and cafeteria lines. Some spoke with admiration, others with surprise. A few simply shook their heads in disbelief after seeing the rankings posted by the district. Zoe Carter had not only earned acceptance into the State Academic Excellence Program, she had finished at the very top of the school's applicants. The achievement felt almost unreal. Yet for Zoe, the strangest part was how ordinary the day still seemed. The same school buses arrived before sunrise. The same bells rang between classes. The same lockers slammed shut as students hurried to lessons. Outside, fresh snow covered the football field in a smooth blanket of white. Inside, however, something had changed. People were seeing her differently. Late that afternoon, Principal Brooks requested a special assembly before winter break. Students filled the auditorium row by row while teachers gathered near the stage. Bright lights illuminated the polished wood floor. A large projection screen displayed student achievements from throughout the semester. Academic awards, athletic accomplishments, community service projects. Parents occupied several rows near the back of the room. Elijah Carter sat among them wearing his best jacket. His hands rested quietly in his lap, though his heart felt anything but calm. Zoe sat with the other students near the front. Principal Brooks stepped to the podium as conversations gradually faded. The auditorium settled into silence. He began by recognizing several students for their accomplishments. Applause echoed repeatedly through the room. Then he paused. His expression grew more thoughtful. "Today," he said, "I want to talk about potential." The word lingered in the air. Brooks glanced across the audience. Potential is often misunderstood. Too many people believe they can measure it simply by looking at someone, by making assumptions, by deciding what they think is possible before the work has even begun. The room grew still. Several teachers exchanged glances. Students listened carefully. Principal Brooks continued. Earlier this year, a student was discouraged from pursuing a highly competitive opportunity, not because of a lack of talent, not because of a lack of effort, but because someone underestimated what that student was capable of becoming. Silence spread across the auditorium. Elijah looked toward the stage. Zoe lowered her eyes toward her folded hands. Principal Brooks turned slightly and motioned toward the large screen behind him. A photograph appeared. Zoe standing beside her research presentation. Beneath it, the district ranking and acceptance announcement filled the screen. A collective murmur swept through the audience. The student I am speaking about is Zoe Carter. Applause erupted immediately. Strong, genuine, sustained. Zoe looked up, startled by the intensity of it. Principal Brooks waited for the room to settle. Then he spoke again. Achievement is important, but what impresses me most is character. Zoe responded to doubt with preparation. She answered discouragement with perseverance. She never demanded recognition. She earned it. Near the side of the stage, Mrs. Grayson sat among the faculty members. Her posture remained composed, but her expression had softened. The certainty she once carried seemed absent now. As the applause continued, Principal Brooks stepped away from the podium and invited Zoe to join him on stage. She walked forward slowly beneath the bright lights. The audience rose to its feet. Parents, students, teachers, the entire auditorium. Elijah felt emotion tightening in his chest as he watched his daughter reach the center of the stage. Principal Brooks handed her a certificate recognizing her achievement. Then, unexpectedly, he turned toward the audience once more. Let this be a reminder, he said quietly. Never allow someone else's expectations to define another person's future. The auditorium fell silent for a moment. Not uncomfortable silence. Reflective silence. The kind that arrives when a truth becomes impossible to ignore. And in that moment, the lesson reached far beyond one student, one teacher, or one achievement. It reached everyone in the room. The assembly ended, but the feeling remained. Students slowly filed out of the auditorium while soft winter sunlight filtered through the high windows near the ceiling. Snow continued falling beyond the glass, covering sidewalks, rooftops, and empty sections of the football field in a blanket of white. Voices echoed through the hallways as groups of students discussed the ceremony they had just witnessed. Yet for Zoe Carter, everything seemed strangely quiet. She carried her certificate carefully against her chest as she walked toward the lobby. The polished floors reflected the afternoon light. Trophy cases lined the walls. Holiday decorations had already begun appearing throughout the building. For the first time in months, she was not thinking about rankings, applications, or proving herself. She was simply breathing. Near the front entrance, Elijah waited beside a row of windows overlooking the parking lot. The moment he saw Zoe, his face softened into a smile that said more than words ever could. She walked toward him. Without speaking, neither of them rushed. Neither seemed concerned about the students moving around them. When she finally reached him, she handed over the certificate. Elijah studied it for several seconds. His eyes moved slowly across the printed words. Recognition. Achievement. Excellence. He nodded once and handed it back. I am proud of you, he said quietly. Zoe smiled. Thank you. It was a simple exchange. Yet both understood everything hidden beneath those words. The long nights, the doubts, the sacrifices, the perseverance. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily through the afternoon air. The world looked calm, almost peaceful. As they turned toward the exit, a familiar voice stopped them. Zoe. Both turned. Mrs. Linda Grayson stood several feet away. The hallway around them seemed to grow quieter. Students continued passing by, but their conversations faded into the background. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Mrs. Grayson stepped forward. Her posture remained composed, but there was something different in her expression now. Something less certain. I wanted to congratulate you, she said. Zoe listened quietly. Your accomplishments are remarkable. The teacher paused. And I realize now that I underestimated you. The admission hung gently in the air. Not dramatic. Not defensive. Simply honest. Zoe glanced briefly toward her father before looking back at the teacher. Months earlier, she might have imagined this moment differently. She might have wanted an explanation, validation, some form of victory. Instead, she felt something unexpected. Peace. Thank you, she replied softly. Mrs. Grayson nodded. For the first time all year, there seemed to be no barrier between them. No assumptions. No expectations. Only understanding. The teacher offered a small smile and continued down the hallway. Elijah watched her leave. Then he looked at his daughter. You handled that well. Zoe shrugged gently. People can learn too. Elijah smiled again. Outside, the late afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds. Golden light spilled across the snow-covered parking lot, turning the white landscape into a field of shimmering reflections. Father and daughter stepped through the front doors together. Cold air greeted them. Their breath drifted upward in pale clouds. The school stood behind them. The future stretched ahead. Neither spoke as they walked across the parking lot. There was no need. The silence felt full rather than empty. Full of lessons learned. Full of quiet victories. Full of possibilities not yet discovered. Behind them, the windows of the school reflected the fading sunlight. Ahead of them, fresh snow crunched softly beneath their shoes. Zoe carried her certificate beneath one arm. Elijah walked beside her. And as the winter sky slowly brightened with the colors of approaching sunset, two shadows stretched across the snow side by side, moving forward together into whatever came next.